sequence, and I also curate the Demystifying media series. We started off this term bringing in 4 different speakers, people from across the different professional and research industries, to really share with you some of the interesting things that are going on across our media space. Today is the last in the series for this term. I'm delighted that we're joined by Dan Hon. Dan, until recently, was the creative director for Code for America. He was a creative director at Biden and Kennedy in Portland, where he worked on campaigns for Facebook, Nike, and others. He's going to be talking you through some of those campaigns and showing you some of the assets that they created. And in a past life, when we first met, we were reckoning about 2008, 2009, he set up and ran his own game startup in London. So Dan's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the different things that he has worked on through his career. And really the thread that kind of is weaved through all of that is the sort of the evolution of content and how that has changed and been disrupted and enabled by technology. So, Dan.
Thanks, Damien. I'm going to talk a bit about content through a lens of government, advertising, and games, which aren't normally 3 things that you would hear together. And I saw from the tweet that Damien had posted that I'm also going to be talking about digital transformation, strategy, product direction, advertising, and creative output. And it's 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I'm sure that there are probably some other more fun places that we could be than necessarily talking about those things. But here we go. So, hello, big deep breath. The School of Journalism and Communications at the University of Oregon. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit, probably just a little bit of boasting. But before I do that, I'd like, if it's okay with you, I have got a 3-year-old, and he's super, super excited because today he thinks I'm going to a really, really big meeting with lots of people. And he doesn't really know. He hasn't yet really understood the concept that sometimes there are good meetings that you can do and there are less good meetings that you can do. Rest assured that this is one of the good meetings. I'm not silently dreading this inside or anything, but it would be really, really awesome if you could wave and say hello to him, because he would really like that. So, hi. That'll make him happy, which means he might brush his teeth tonight. So this is me. I'm Dan. The BBC News labelled me as a Pirate Bay user back in 2004 when doing that was still a thing, and I was happy to go on TV and admit to being a Pirate Bay user. I used to be, I've been a lawyer, so I've been a really, really irritating person who used to wear a suit every day and have to fill in timesheets. I qualified as an intellectual property lawyer. Damien mentioned that I've also worked in startups. So after I qualified as a lawyer and made my parents very, very happy, I decided to quit and not be a lawyer anymore and joined a startup. And this startup was called Mind Candy. Mind Candy was an internet and game startup that we formed in London in 2004. And we built something called an alternate reality game back then called Perplex City that I'll talk a little bit more about. But what Perplex City was, what that alternate reality game was, it was the world's first monetized collectible card game, internet-connected alternate reality game, and it won a bunch of awards. And because it was a startup, it won awards but didn't make enough money, which is why, in part, I'm here today and not a billionaire. So don't do that, or do that and actually make it work. So that's Perplex City. One of those games that we made. After that, my brother and I quit that startup because they wanted to make... Are you undergrads, postgrads, most people here under 25, over 25? Under 25, okay. This might be a bit embarrassing. Do you know what Club Penguin is? Okay. You don't have to admit to ever having played Club Penguin. I just want to check if you know what it is. Mind Candy, that startup that made Perplex City, they decided to do what is now called a pivot, which is where you decide that what you were doing was wrong and then now you want to do something else. And they decided to create a 2.5D kids virtual community online, essentially Club Penguin. And at the time, Disney had just bought Club Penguin for a stupendous amount of money. And my brother and I, who are at this startup, thought to ourselves, it's probably not a good idea to go up against Disney when they've just brought one of the big competitors and they can just Disneyify everything. And the corollary to that is that sometimes when a giant corporation buys something that's going well, it doesn't mean that it's going to keep going well. And Mindcandy have done very well afterwards. So at Six to Start, we were really interested, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but we're really interested in building new kinds of storytelling that were or are native to the internet. So new kinds of digital media that you can only do online. One of the things that we did, so we worked with a bunch of clients like Disney in Parks Resorts Online, the BBC, Channel 4, so big broadcasters in the UK, and Penguin, the publishers. We won awards from South by Southwest, so we won Best Game, Best Experimental. In a big surprise, we won Best of Show one year, which we really didn't expect. We didn't expect it to the extent that we were just hanging out in the bar, and then they had to kind of stop the award ceremony and try and find us because we didn't think that we actually needed to be there. I imagine they're probably more organized now. One of the things that we made, and again, I'll show this a bit later, was something called We Tell Stories. And that kind of really goes to the heart, I think, of something that we built way back in 2007 or 2008 that I think hasn't necessarily been replicated since, which goes to the heart of how digital media is super interesting in terms of content, how we build that content, how we distribute that content, and the kind of stories that we can tell. After that, I worked at Wieden & Kennedy, first in their London office for about a year while I was waiting for my green card to come through. And then I joined the Portland office as a creative director. Started working out on the Nike account as a CD, and then did a stint on Sony, on Coca-Cola Global, and also worked on the Facebook account, which was really, really interesting. One of the big things that happened at Wieden at the time, and I guess is still happening in some agencies, is this whole what do we do about digital and what are advertising agencies supposed to be doing. In the time that I was at Wieden, we saw teams change from just briefing a copywriter and an art director into that big team that you see around the table there. Back in 2011, when I joined, you would have just had two people sitting in a room working on a brief and then coming back with a script. And it was really, really hard work and a really big change to start bringing all these other people into the room and figuring out how they could work together to come up with creative solutions to briefs for clients and then figure out how to pitch them, how to get them won, justify why they make sense, and then actually produce them and produce them well. So that meant doing things like working on Nike's 2012 Olympic campaign, which was really, really crazy. Not least of which because I don't think we had approved scripts until about 7 weeks before the opening ceremony. And this would have been for an international shoot and loads of other crazy things. After that, most recently I've been working at Code for America. Code for America is a 501c3 that is essentially founded upon the premise that the government in general in America is just really, really not very good at technology. Most companies and corporations and non-profits aren't really good at technology in the first place, but government is especially bad. It spends a lot of money doing things that don't really work, and I've got one specific example that really, really doesn't work. And the ethos that Code for America are trying to do, and where they kind of partly came from, was partly around what happened with the healthcare.gov disaster. So when that site went live, when a cornerstone to Obama's presidency and the Affordable Care Act came out and the website just fell over, some people in government started realizing that actually maybe we'd better figure out how to make stuff that works, and it might be a good idea to talk to people in Silicon Valley who actually know how to do this, rather than the traditional government contractors that normally do that stuff. Because I'm British, I never really grew up with Richard Scarry, or Scary? How do you, Richard, Business Town? Yeah? There's an awesome Tumblr that someone's made called Welcome to Business Town, which is basically full of really, really sarcastic and pointed commentary about the type of job titles that you get now. Right now, most distressingly, this is probably the one that most fits me. I do like tiny Post-its. I think empathy is awesome. I do a lot of stuff with whiteboards, but I don't own anything from anthropology. But essentially, this is the kind of hard-to-describe work that I do now, which is figure out what the problem is. And sometimes it's actually really, really hard for people to tell you what they think their problem is. And then figure out exactly how you're going to solve that problem in a big roundabout way. So I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm going to divide it up into three different sections. The first is what happened when content met the internet over the last 10 years. The second one is where you get the collision between strategy, product, and content. And the last one is basically saying that digital transformation is really, really hard, and it would be a lot easier for everyone to just go shopping and ignoring. So, content meet internet. I promised you, or I said that I would talk about this thing called an alternate reality game. Has anyone heard of anything like that before? It's perfectly fine to just completely look at me blankly, because it's 3:15 on a Friday afternoon now, so there's only about 45 minutes left. So I'll take you back to April 2001, which makes me feel really old now. In 2001, April 2001, YouTube is minus 4 years old. I have no idea what we did on the internet back then. Wikipedia is around 3 months old, but inexplicably still contains over 1 million articles about Magic the Gathering and Star Wars. And this meme, do any of you recognize this meme? Wow. Oh, okay. Well, one of the earliest memes is 3 years old and is old enough to go to preschool. And I'm in my final year at college, and I'm trying very, very hard to procrastinate and avoid revising for my finals. And then this trailer comes out.
When's your birthday? I never had a birthday.
His name is David.
I feel it. That's creepy. Whoa, that's so real.
In a distant future, in an age of intelligent machines, he is the first robotic child programmed to love and coexist as a member of a family. His is a tale of humanity and a journey to find his place among humans and machines.
I'm a boy.
You are a real boy. At least as real as I've ever made one.
So with that movie, Haley Joel Osment sealed his legacy as being a really, really creepy kid actor. And again, so this was 2001, and this was a big deal. They hid some stuff. Hiding stuff and doing viral campaigns now is not a big deal. But one of the things that kind of made everyone go a bit crazy when this trailer came out was the credit for a sentient machine therapist. You know, you kind of know who Stan Winston is. You know what Industrial Light and Magic do. You know what Bob Ringwood, well, you know what a costume designer does. You don't necessarily know what a sentient machine therapist does. Or at least we didn't back in 2001. So you would Google, because Google was a brand new search engine that was super awesome back then. You'd Google Janine Saller, and then you would find her webpage. You'd find her family webpage, and then you'd find out that she worked at Bangalore World University. You'd find out that she had an email address and a phone number, and that you could call up that phone number. And that if you called up that phone number, well, she'd be out of the office at the moment. But she'd left a really super important message for people who are interested in her friend, who had died under mysterious circumstances. And what all of that ended up being was a world that had been brought to life through a whole bunch of real-world activities, so through websites, through meetups, through physical artifacts, that behaved as if it were real, that you could email, that you could fax, because people, I don't know why people had fax machines in 2001, there's no reason why they should have them. But you could interact with it, and it updated all the time. It felt like it was real, or as real as anything else that you could access through a web browser. And that was super exciting for a whole bunch of people. Yahoo groups, people still used Yahoo in 2001. There was a big mailing list that spun up to kind of figure out what was happening. It was like a giant whodunit that happened through people discovering clues and figuring out puzzles and finding out what was happening. So, for example, if you wanted to know what a certain character in this story was doing, what you might try and do was that you might try and find their email address. And if you found their email address, you might be able to get into their email account and read what they'd been writing. What that also meant was that you suddenly had this big mass of players collaborating together. Back in 2001, that wouldn't mean using something like Twitter or Slack. It would mean using something like IRC. And again, the super interesting thing about this was that there were these people who, for all intents and purposes, when these updates to the game came out on a Tuesday night, it felt like appointment to view television. A new chapter had just come out, and suddenly there was a whole bunch of stuff to do. People made a whole bunch of friends. At least 3 or 4 marriages have come out of people playing that game. At least, I think, 5 children have come out of playing that game. Because it was pretty much like, hey, I'm super into this TV show. Do you like that TV show too? Awesome, let's go watch it together. Now we can talk about other stuff. I think it was a really interesting example of something that took what is really, really fundamental to the internet, which is things can be linked together. Anything can be linked together, and then pulling a story back out of it. Because what they didn't do was they didn't just say, here's one website and here's all the stuff. You actually had to go looking for it. And there's a lot of stuff that works well with that, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't work well with it. It turns out that there was a scaling problem in that type of entertainment because it's actually pretty hard work. You don't normally get more than, say, 5,000 to 10,000 people actually playing through and doing all that stuff because in the grand scheme of things, it's fundamentally a lot easier to just lie back and wait for Netflix to be invented and then watch something on TV as opposed to having to do all of this work. Again, there are a lot of people who would passively enjoy this stuff and watch the people playing it and use that as entertainment. But for those 5,000 to 10,000 people, it was a different kind of thing to do. It satisfied a different kind of need. It was the great storytelling of a great book or a great serialized TV show, along with I get to find out everything that I want to find out about this universe, and I can also impact it. Since then, a whole bunch of stuff has happened. And so you have to be really, really careful because I literally, and I explained this to Damien, I have just made up all the stuff on this graph, and it just looks a little bit more like you should believe it because it's got a graph and it's got an x-axis and a y-axis. But see, I've even labeled that just some sort of y-axis. I don't even know what that might be. But what I want you to think about is there's a whole bunch of easy stuff that we did when the internet came out. There was a whole bunch of stuff that I like to call just format shifting because the distribution method just got a lot easier. The distribution barrier just got a lot easier. If you look at stuff like podcasts like Welcome to Night Vale and Serial, and then This American Life, which has just gone independent, the internet coming along and finally enough people being able to use it, which has only ever really happened in the last 8 years or so because of stuff like this, means that you just don't have to go through a gatekeeper anymore. You can come up with your own podcast or you can come up with your own thing, an easy to produce thing, and there is nothing necessarily in the way of that being potentially in front of as many people as there are on the internet. There are lots of other things that you need to deal with as well, but in terms of the easiest types of media that we have ever produced, so images and text, sound, music, they're super, super easy for anyone and everyone in the world to see them now. So it feels a bit like the easiest stuff that we've been making, the stuff like books and ebooks and Kindle downloads, iBooks, music, YouTube, Netflix, and Hulu aren't fundamentally new kinds of media. They're the media that we're already pretty good at making, that a lot of people are really comfortable with, that can now get in front of people in a significantly different way. So that isn't to say that a massive change hasn't happened in terms of distribution. I don't need to be another person who would have to tell you that when I grew up in England, we had 4 TV channels, and then we were super excited when there was a 5th one, and that we had to wait between episodes for things. But with YouTube, with Netflix, with Hulu, we still have just to the extent that it's just format shifting. We have linear video that anyone can produce, that can get in front of everyone. Then we've got stuff that feels like it's a bit in the middle, where it feels a little bit more, you could only do this online. You could kind of do Netflix. In fact, you did do Netflix by just mailing people a crap ton of DVDs all the time. But for stuff like Snowfall, for stuff like what Channel 4 and the BBC were doing in the UK in terms of new media stuff, they were really interested in, well, what could we do that we couldn't do any other way but for the internet, but for the fact that everyone has a web browser, or but for the fact that everyone has a mobile phone. Instead of writing the same news that we always do, or telling a story that we always do, and just putting the words on the screen. So one analogy that I like to use is that a Kindle or an iPhone can do a whole bunch of really, really amazing things. But what we've got with Kindles and iBooks and everything else is still fundamentally someone sitting down in front of Microsoft Word, typing a whole bunch, and then just getting it to you in a different way. It doesn't do anything else. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's still just fundamentally a book. And so we started to see these experiments. Channel 4 in the UK was really interesting because they decided to spend a whole bunch of money on new media instead of TV. So Channel 4 are a publicly funded broadcaster in the UK, or a publicly owned broadcaster. So they're a bit like PBS, only they have ads and they never beg you for money. But they are designed, just like the BBC, to provide a specific public function. One of the things that they're supposed to do is to provide education programming, education content for teenagers. You've got the BBC for all of the literature and arts and maths stuff and all the science stuff. But one niche that Channel 4 filled in the UK, or fills in the UK, is stuff like life skills, like how do I cope with coming out to my friends? How do I know what job I want to have when I grow up? Do I even know if I want to go to university or not? The soft stuff compared to the hard academic stuff. And one realization that Channel 4 had back in 2008 was that they did the equivalent of a Pew media usage survey, and they found out that to reach the 15 to 19-year-olds that they were required to reach in terms of their charter, in terms of what government wanted them to do, those people were spending most of their time online. Smartphones weren't really a thing yet, but using laptops and stuff, and especially in the UK, being on MSN Messenger was a really, really big deal. What they weren't doing was consuming the kind of media that Channel 4 was using to reach that audience. Because what Channel 4 was doing to reach that audience was producing TV programming that would go out between 10 and 12 o'clock in the morning, or 10 a.m. and midday, that they hoped that teachers in classrooms would record and then show to a class full of people. And everyone, I think, would agree that if you're not at school at 10 to 12, then you've probably got way more interesting things to be doing than watching educational TV programs. So what they decided to do was to take all of that money and say, if our audience is spending time online, then let's make online stuff, whatever that may be, whether it's a YouTube series or whether it's a whole bunch of games. But there are different ways of us achieving the exact same aim, or meeting the exact same need that we have the responsibility to meet, but through different media now. And that was a really, really big deal for a broadcaster, because Channel 4, even as one of the youngest broadcasters in the UK, had been created in 1982. So they still had 20 years of history. Never mind like the BBC, which I had the fortune and misfortune to deal with. They've got a lot of legacy and a lot invested in just making TV as opposed to making anything else. And then you've got what might be these viable new species. So you've got the team at BuzzFeed. So there's a friend that I made who reads my newsletter called Stacey Marie Ishmael, who is on the BuzzFeed News app team. And what they've been doing is super interesting in terms of redefining what journalism looks like and what that type of media looks like and how you get access to it. Quartz has done something really interesting lately where, and I kind of think it's a bit of a misstep, but their new iPhone app uses a conversational interface, which, if you're a geek, is the super hot thing right now, where you talk to stuff or you pretend to talk to stuff and it just tells you the news. What Vox have been doing have been really interesting in terms of, I think, for some of these types of companies, especially I think BuzzFeed and Vox, what they've realized is that the tools that you use to create media are really, really important, because sometimes they just might not exist yet. I think there's only so far that you can get when you are using a conventional CMS or conventional tools like Word, for example. So going back to my Wyden and Kenny example, we would give a brief, as CDs, we'd agree a brief with the strategist and we'd hand it over to the creative team. But the best tool that they had for conceiving and persuading and telling us about a fully integrated campaign would be a bunch of words that they had put together inside a Word document, or a deck that they would, at Wyden, ask Studio to put together, or if the art director was particularly good, that the art director had actually spent some time on. So that point about the tools not really being there yet, it's really hard to talk about an interactive experience. It's really hard to have a good discussion about an interactive experience without actually using it. There's that really somewhat trite quote about dancing about architecture, but you can only get so far in terms of saying, oh yeah, we should totally make a thing about when it snowed a lot, but use lots of video. And it would be really different than anything the New York Times has ever done before, without actually being able to show it, without actually being able to react to it. So, some examples. It was interesting that this popped up in my RSS reader about a week or so ago, that Google was experimenting with unprintable ebooks. And that was kind of the thing that we were trying to get across in 2008 with the experiment that we did with Penguin, the We Tell Stories experiment. And the idea behind that was Penguin is a publisher. And you can take that to mean that Penguin is a publisher that commissions stories from authors, discovers them as well, and then distributes them to people. But then if you get more specific than that, then you have to say, well, they distribute them to people in the form of bits of dead tree bound together that they have to ship to either bookstores, or they accept whatever terms that Amazon tells them to accept this week. But there was something interesting in saying, okay, well, Penguin's done some other really, really interesting stuff before. Penguin has arguably invented media formats before. They invented the mass market paperback. It didn't exist. So there's nothing necessarily by looking in the history of the company and saying, well, what is Penguin actually about? They're really good at paper and getting stuff onto paper and then moving the bits of paper around. They're really good at making sure that the right things get onto the paper before they put all the paper together. But is the paper really the be-all and end-all, or are there other things that they might also be good at? So what we did with Penguin was we worked with a bunch of their six of their best-selling authors to do a series of experiments. And the experiments that we did were really hard to do because I can't find my cursor. There it is. All about finding six. What we wanted to do was we wanted to make it really easy for ourselves. The first thing that you want to do if you're going to invent a new media format is to not come up with a brand new story that no one wants to hear. So you cheat. You take something that's out of copyright and you essentially do a reboot. You do what Hollywood has learned to do, which is, oh yeah, everyone knows that story, but I want to see a grittier, darker, R-rated version of that. I already kind of know what it's going to be about. So you find a story that's out of copyright. You go through your backlist of authors, and you find ones who might be particularly suited to that genre. And crucially, you find ones who are actually willing to experiment with new media. We spent around 2 years at the startup, trying to persuade really good storytellers to be interested in new media. Because we had started with the whole point of view that you're not really going to get anywhere if you don't have good stories to tell in the first place. Like, I don't want to work with a 2-bit author. I want to work with J.K. Rowling. I want to work with people who are really, really good at what they do. And I'm super excited about the potential afforded by this new media. But that's never going to work if the people I want to work with fundamentally just want to make TV shows. And it's totally fine for them to want to make TV shows. A slight digression. Has anyone seen, there's a show on Hulu, I think, called Misfits? No? Okay. It's a British TV show. It's essentially about what would happen if a group of, we have this thing in Britain called an ASBO, which is a antisocial behavior order, which is basically you've been hanging around malls causing trouble, so the police puts a tag on you and they just watch what you're doing and you have to wear like an orange jumpsuit or something. It's socially exclusionary, intended to discourage certain behavior, and basically you get yobs. It's a certain kind of... Anyway, what would happen, the premise behind the TV show was what would happen if socially maladjusted teenagers got superpowers and didn't feel like saving the day all the time and just wanted to be teenagers. Which, just from reading the outline when we worked with the broadcaster, was actually, that's pretty interesting. It would also be interesting because it was on a TV channel that wasn't afraid of showing graphic sex and violence and swearing. So it wouldn't be like Dawson's Creek, but with superpowers. It would actually be British style, lots of swear words that I'm not allowed to say on campus. And the script was great. We really, really wanted to work with this guy. And we were super excited about what he could do with the universe that he had created through new media. But it turned out that all he really wanted to do, and all he ever really wanted to do, was just make a good TV show. And we had to go, okay, well, that's fine. So coming back to this, it was really important for us to find authors, writers, storytellers who were really interested in what we're doing. One of the examples that we have, which feels depressingly out of date now, was working with a guy called Charles Cumming, who has written a whole bunch of well-regarded and well-selling books, spy thrillers, basically. He also wrote, I think, the Young Bond series. So he's written a whole bunch of novelizations about how awesome James Bond would have been as a teenager, which is totally not an attempt to cash in on the whole young adult market. They're also pretty good. But what we did with this was we retold the story of the 39 steps, but we just did it through Google Maps. I say just did it through Google Maps. And it turned out that we learned a whole bunch of interesting stuff. Charles did a first draft, and it turned out, after we started building the CMS, the content management system for all of this, that writing a novel in Word just doesn't work when you've got this amount of space. So we built a new content management system. We built a drafting system where he could actually type straight into the pop-ups that would happen. And there's one really good story that I like. If you go through, you follow this guy around just like the little line, the dotted line in Indiana Jones. There was a bit that he wrote, there was a beat that he wrote in the story where our protagonist was super stressed out and was in a hotel in Edinburgh and was doing the equivalent of just pacing around the room thinking a lot. And when we stuck that in, it turned out that it was really, really boring to watch because the pinpoint just stayed there for 2 minutes. So Charles could go back at it, and he was like, okay, well, there's something that I need to do to the story here. There's something that I need to change. We need to introduce some motion into this. We need to introduce some movement into that. And I think that's the kind of understanding that you don't get until you're actually working directly with the medium. You can think about it in abstract, but unless and until you start actually working with the material directly, there's something that we talk about in terms of the heft of it or the feel of it. You are just having kind of abstract ideas that haven't really been put into practice yet, that you don't know how they feel. So that's the first bit, a bit of an overview of how the internet kind of approached content as a bit of a super scary train at about 100 miles an hour. And what I have now are a few examples about how strategy, product, and content fit together. And the thread that kind of brings all this together is just asking one question, which is, what does my audience need? Not what do I need, but what does my audience need? What do my users need? I don't suppose that you normally think about users from a communications or a journalism point of view, just audiences, but there's this kind of confluence between, you can't just think of content as the thing that goes inside the product anymore, or content as the thing that goes inside the service anymore. You might be able to in some degree, but there's just no way that you can separate them in the way that we have been able to separate them in the past. And what do I mean by a user need? Well, a user need that feels like a real one or that is a real one. So a valid user need might be something like, you know what, I just want some entertainment at the end of the day so that I can feel better. It's perfectly fine. A user need is not something like, as a user, I want to participate in conversations with trusted brand partners to find out about great value opportunities in sports apparel purchasing, which is what you might find in an advertising brief, and which you should really talk to your creative director about and say, can you please shoot the people who wrote this brief, because no one talks like this. Things that people never say. People never say, oh, you know what, I wish that there was an open and flexible operating system that addresses the needs of all stakeholders of the connected device ecosystem. No one wants that. No one wants an open source software framework that offers seamless device-to-device connectivity to address the emerging needs of the Internet of Things. Someone at Samsung should be shot for wanting that and then letting someone else write that. Here's another example. I got a new Apple TV, so I put the new Vivo app on it. I never knew that I wanted an immersive lean-back experience for watching my favorite music videos. Have you ever had an immersive lean-back experience? Or have you ever wanted a reimaginized personal experience? Or have you wanted to simultaneously lean back and also be immersed? Or wanted it to be really intuitive to navigate your favorite artists? People don't talk like this. People just want to listen to music and kind of not have to deal with all the crap that gets in the way. So what's a need that someone might have? I might want to feel motivated. There might just be a whole bunch of things that I need to do. Motivation's an easy one. Motivation's a really, really good one that Wyden has had a very long history of working with Nike with. So this is one of the spots that we put together. This was our anthem spot for the 2012 Olympics. Oops.
Greatness, it's just something we made up. Somehow we've come to believe that greatness is a gift reserved for a chosen few, for prodigies, for superstars, and the rest of us can only stand by watching. You can forget that. Greatness is not some rare DNA strand. It's not some precious thing. Greatness is no more unique to us than breathing. We're all capable of it. All of us.
So in a bad way, for a while we called that the fat kid spot before we came up with a better name for it. The thing about that, or at least the thing that we really liked about it at Wyden, and the thing that Nike really, really liked about it, and that in the end persuaded them to run it as their big brand spot during the opening ceremony, was that there was something about saying that right now you're going to be watching the Olympics, and these are people who are the absolute top perfection of human performance and potential. And that can feel super exclusionary. And Nike at the same time had been doing a lot of communications that were basically showing you super awesome, really, really fit people being really, really good at the things that they do. And that this was an opportunity at that moment during the opening ceremonies to remind you that Nike also was for everybody else and was also absolutely about just getting up and doing it. That anyone can do it, that if that guy can do it, you can do it as well. All he has in him is the exact same thing that's inside everyone else, which is that tiny, tiny little sliver of motivation. And that we want to draw a direct comparison between him and the people who you're seeing parading around with all of their flags right now. There's another way that you can do motivation, though. You can do it through comms, like emails, like marketing emails. I got this in my email in September last year. Your hard work will pay off, Calvin. Don't be discouraged by last week's results. We believe in you. Set a weight goal. Some of you who are paying attention might be able to see where this is going if you pay attention to the weight. Set a weight goal. Calvin weighs 29.2 pounds. That's because he's 2.5 years old. Withings, the guys who make my smart scale, know that he's 2.5 years old because we told them. We put his birth date in his profile. That's why they know his name. They're trying to motivate him into achieving his weight goal of losing weight while simultaneously knowing that he's about 30 months old. So when people tell you, oh yeah, big data is totally going to be awesome for content and everything, this is tiny data. This is like one field. But someone somehow still managed to approve sending out comms in an email about educating you about a product that completely missed the point or didn't really think about what people might be using the product for. What's another need? You might have a need to not feel alone. So we had a brief, a really, really amazing brief. The brief was make people hate Facebook less, which was also really hard work. And mainly because when you're in a comms agency, your job is to make comms. Your job's to make advertising. You might think that there are a whole bunch of other ways to solve the problem, especially in the days of integrated campaigns and digital stuff. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, your job is to make the communications and to find a way for communications or see if communications can solve the problem. So if, for example, with Facebook, we want to remind you that Facebook is actually pretty good for not feeling alone, you might make a film like this. I saw some people smiling, which is exactly what Facebook wanted. Because then after that we could say, yay, we made people hate Facebook just a tiny little bit less. You also might make something like this, which is another way of showing what Facebook actually does for you and distracting you for a tiny bit from all the other things that Mark Zuckerberg is doing.
squeeze you hard.
Thank
I
you.
love you, baby.
Love you too.
So I'm here in the middle of my chemo treatment, and I'm feeling weaker now, and that sucks.
What color do you have an idea of color? Or? I think this is the one out.
Allison, are you happy that you're finished?
Can't believe it.
Last dance. Let's see it. Work it, girl. Work it. Let's see.
So you find a real need. You find something that is true. There's absolutely nothing wrong with telling that story. There are, let's see, so it's 3:50, and I technically have quite a few slides to do. So I'm going to have a quick look at what I've got next. And, okay, I think I'll show a couple more things. There's another one. This one, I'll show this one first, and then I'll say a few words about it. This one also might make people cry, but for a different reason. If you ever work at Wyden and Kennedy, the big show and tells that they do in the atrium, where every so often we get together and then we show everyone the work. People who've been there for a while normally know to bring tissues with them because they can get super emotional. So this might be another one of those. So this one is about, I'll show it and then I'll talk a little bit about it. No, not that. Oh, I know what's happening. Sorry. It's trying to show two at exactly the same time. Okay. So Procter & Gamble, at least the way that we talk about this sometimes at Wyden, had found themselves in the situation where apparently they had accidentally sponsored the Olympics, which you'd think wouldn't be something that you could accidentally do because it's quite expensive. And to be clear about this, it was P&G who had sponsored the Olympics, not any of their individual consumer brands. It wasn't Tide or anyone. It was just P&G. And they came to the agency and they said, this is a bit weird because we've got the Olympics and we're going to have to make a shit ton of ads for it. And we're not quite sure what we're going to say because we're P&G. And P&G doesn't mean anything to the people who buy our products because we invested everything in all of the sub-brands, right? So the saving role that was done by the lead planner and the strategist on this, was to try and find a way to justify what P&G might conceivably have to do with the Olympics, and also bring it back to the people who actually buy their products, which was that every single athlete has a mum. Every single athlete has someone who gave birth to them. Every single athlete has someone who helped raise them in some way. And to show viscerally and with stupendously high production values what it means, and to tell through film the story of what those mums do for their kids and what their kids mean to them. And when you're able to create that real emotional connection, then that's when you have something like effective advertising. The one last example that I want to show before we do a little bit of Q&A is kind of ties it back to some of the work that I've been doing in government. So one need is, do I have enough money, or where am I going to get the money to know that I'm going to have something to eat this week, or that I'm going to be able to feed my kids? One answer to that is the SNAP program, is the food stamp program, right? This is what it looks like to apply for the food stamp program in California. You can do it by filling out a whole bunch of forms, but for most people, the easiest way of doing it, or the most convenient way of doing it, is by going online, because then you can do it in your own time, right? Well, it turns out that it's actually really difficult to do, because if you think about the type of people who need food stamp assistance, who need food assistance, they don't have a lot of time, they're working a lot of jobs, and it's a super stressful and depressing situation to be in. It's not like you're sitting in Starbucks going, I think I'll apply for food stamps today. Was going to go for a walk in the park, but got nothing else to do. Let's kill a couple of hours. You get language like this. Your food stamp benefits in this quarter did not change as a result of the documents or information we received, because it would not have resulted in an increase in benefits. The county has refigured your food stamps using the information you reported in the food. I'm a well-educated person, and I'm not entirely sure what this means. And I'm not stressed about where my next meal is going to come from. So one of the things that we did at Code for America was we did a teardown. Teardown is when we take an existing service, and it sounds really mean, but it's not really. It just means annotating the experience of going through it. So this is how long it takes and everything you need to do to apply for food stamps in the state of California. There are something like, I want to say, probably 80 screens worth of information that you need to fill in. I don't know if any of you drive for Uber, but it doesn't take this long. You don't have to answer all of these questions. You almost might think that if you were trying to apply for this, that the people administering it or delivering it didn't actually care whether you got it or not. Because seriously, why is it this hard? It's almost as if the people designing it and delivering it never actually thought to fill it in. So that's been one of the really, really big things that I've been doing in government. So I kind of did my time in advertising, and then I came out and I had to go in completely the opposite direction. I'd been a lawyer and I'd worked in advertising, so I needed to do something to balance the entire world out. This just isn't on. These types of online services where people haven't thought about, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Does the product actually do that? Does it get out of the way? Does it respect the user's time? Does it actually demonstrate any empathy, sympathy, or compassion for the audience or users who are using it? Doesn't mean you can't be entertaining, doesn't mean you can't be fun, doesn't matter what need you're trying to fulfill. But do you know what that need is? Have you thought about the different ways that you can fulfill it? Sometimes it might just be comms. Sometimes it might be comms and product, comms and service. Sometimes it might just be a film. It's entirely fine for an ad agency to just still make good TV ads. They fill a purpose. They solve a problem. But they don't solve every single problem. So what I'm doing right now is I'm helping the Department for Social Services, Health and Human Services Agency in California. They were about to spend $500 million on the new child welfare IT system. $500 million is a lot of money. And it was a child welfare system for basically kids who are being abused. And it was going to go to a giant IT contract that in all likelihood would have just been really, really difficult to use or just wouldn't have worked. And a lot of the work there is just figuring out, well, who are the people who need to be using this and how do we actually make it easy to use? And that isn't impossible. It just requires you to stop and think hard about it. It's not really, it's not too difficult to do. It's just hard. Just requires a lot of people working together. And that, I think, is a big thing that I wanted to say about digital transformation. Like, I've worked with organizations, massive, the BBC is a media organization that's probably 100 years old or close to it. Digital transformation is a really, really big deal for them, like it is for the New York Times, like it is for the Washington Post, and figuring out what is it that we're supposed to do, how do we fit in. For Penguin as well, it was what is the core thing that this company or that this group of people actually does? And what does the internet mean to how we do it? Doesn't mean we have to stop doing the things that we're already good at, but it means, or it's an opportunity to re-examine what it is that we do and to see and deal with candidly if there are better ways or alternate ways of solving those problems. That's the really big deal. For example, in government, one of the things that they were going to do with this $500 million child welfare system was take every single form that already existed in the system and just turn it into a PDF. Whereas they had the opportunity, or they now have the opportunity to go, this form that includes 50 different questions, do we actually need to ask all of them? What's the point of this form? Does this form just exist because someone made it up 5 years ago to cover their ass for some other thing? Because when we went through that teardown for food stamps, through the application process, we found examples. Well, we would go back and say, you've just asked for this documentation. Do you know why you're asking for it? Because we went through the legislation and the regulations, and you're not required to collect this information. And then we showed it to the director, and the director said, I don't know. So they stopped requiring it. And in the end, part of that doesn't really have anything to do with digital. It just has a lot to do with what is it that you're trying to do, and what's the best way to do it, and what are the ways to do it. I've gone over, but any questions? Or I'll ask some of you some questions. Oh, one.
How did you get the little boy for the Nike campaign? Like, was there auditions held?
Yeah, casting.
Really?
Yeah. So that kid was casting. The woman going through her first chemo treatment was casting, was looking out. One of the really good producers at Wyden is someone who actually has a history of working on reality TV shows. But there is Wyden deals a lot in authenticity because you can't fake it. You can't substitute for it. So even the stuff where we showed the cosplay, all the cosplayers getting ready, we just went down to Sacramento and then got in touch with a bunch of people who were going to be at that convention and said, do you mind if we film you and put something together? Because we knew, or we were confident enough in ourselves that we would get much better footage that way than casting from scratch and then just making something up. Yeah.
You said that you're trying to make government documents a lot easier for users.
Mm-hmm.
Have they touched FAFSA in the past, 20 years or so?
Touched?
FAFSA and
Which?
financial aid.
Oh.
Half that stuff.
So, my guess would be no. There is a new thing called the US Digital Service, which is essentially wholesale importing people who know how to make good digital services into US government. So it's a whole bunch of ex-Google, Facebook, Twitter people. and who are kind of systematically going through US government trying to fix all of that stuff. So that exact same example with stuff like food stamps and the SNAP program applies to every single interaction that people have with government, because government is still designed around paper, completely and absolutely. The way that they digitize stuff right now is a paper form already exists, and it's much easier in terms of bureaucracy to just take the paper form and make a digital version of it than to look at that paper form and say, is this even the right form in the first place? And that's the bit about this just being hard work. Has nothing to do with can you make a good website or not. Well, sometimes it does, because it turns out people can be really bad at making websites as well. Just like in the healthcare.gov example. The healthcare.gov example is a combination of not doing the hard work and also arguable incompetence at the actual task at hand of building a large-scale web service. Which again is the difference between, can you get the product right, can you do the engineering, and from a content point of view, from a meaning point of view, do you actually have the clarity, both internally to know what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then can you communicate that clarity? Can you actually explain to people what is it that you're trying to do? Why is it, for example, that Vivo thinks it's okay to talk that way about its product? Who do they think they're talking to? Who do they think their audience are? And why do they think using those words in that way is useful? Have they actually done the hard work to stop and say, well, this will probably get me a good talk at South by Southwest, and I can talk about designing an immersive lean-back experience with a hashtag, and then we can go out to all the parties in Austin. And they're not even that fun anymore because the lines are too long and you can't get in. And then when you do get in, you can't get to the bar. But yeah, so government basically is pretty much very broken. It is a lot easier in terms of transformation. It's really difficult. If you come in at the right place at the right time, you can make a really big difference in an existing institution. But ultimately, from my experience, it requires political capital and for the person right at the actual top to give a shit about it. Or, and this is the way, it depends on kind of, I think, your capacity for patience. Unless, for example, the BBC or the New York Times wants to go full on, yes, we will, if we have to, we'll throw the baby out with the bathwater and we will build a native digital product. Unless you know that that's going to happen, there's only so much transformation, I think, or so much change, I think, that an institution can bear, especially when that institution gets older. The BBC is just made of people who are now in managing positions who, for all we know, from ever since they were 5 years old, wanted to be the editor of a newspaper that was delivered onto your doorstep every day. And I've worked with people who have just always wanted to make TV programs. And it's not that they hate the internet and all the stuff that you can do with them. It's not that they hate video games and all the awesome stuff that you can do and how they can entertain people in different ways now that just didn't exist when they really, really wanted to be a TV director or a channel controller commissioning all of this output. That's absolutely fine. But at the end of it, when you think about what it is, what need is it that an organization is fulfilling, then at some point, leadership and the executive needs to get out of the way and say, what are the other ways that we can be doing this? Because the internet is disruptive. It will come along and it doesn't care whether you always wanted to be a TV director or not. And in some ways, it might be great. It might mean that, you know, I can just go to Netflix and I can do my TV show there, or I can just start doing it on YouTube. But that's the kind of the pro-con that you deal with on the institutional side, which is they have massive, massive resources and they have massive, massive reach, but they absolutely have inertia. Even when your leadership, or even when the person right at the very top wants to make that change, everyone else is there because they want to work at a newspaper, not necessarily because they want to do new stuff. So the flip side of the coin is, it is easier than ever before to just go and do your new thing. But then you've got to be patient, because you're not going to get that audience overnight. You're not going to get those users overnight. every single overnight success story that you read about has probably taken around 5 years to get really good, to kind of hit that. And that's the ones that succeed. It's not, at the same time, it's not a zero-sum game. You know, it's really easy to look at stuff like BuzzFeed, for example, which I think is brilliant, and the stuff that Vox do, which I think is brilliant, but then I think The Toast is brilliant, and what Mallory Ortberg and Nicole Cliff are doing is absolutely amazing, which is a small indie press, effectively. You know, they're practically a zine, but what they're doing is really good, and what they're doing in terms of writers is really good. Yep.
Stop them for a minute. I know you've got lots more stuff that you would love to say. Dan will be sticking around. Outside we have coffee and drinks and cookies and cupcakes and all this kind of stuff, so please do stick around. I've been busy sharing some of the videos that Dan kindly showed via this hashtag, so if you want to find some of those to be able to look at them again, look at the Demystifying hashtag. I think it gives us lots to think about in terms of making the most of the medium, putting the audience and the user first. These are kind of maxims that we all know, but perhaps don't do as often as perhaps we need to. Dan, thank you once again for joining us today.